All right. Well, my name's Scott DeLahunta, working with the Center for Dance Research, and this is a conversation on communities. We did a series of conversations on touch last year with various members of DaRE, and we decided we'd continue with another topic which seemed very relevant for today. And joining me today is Vicki Thoms and Rosemary Lee from the Center for Dance Research, and really delighted to have Juliet Simpson from the Center for Arts, Memory and Communities here with us as well. And this is a very informal conversation, so nobody's chairing. We're going to just open up the topic, very kind of probably get a sense of what it means for each one of us, and then proceed with the conversation for a little while until we feel that it's finished. And I thought, I mentioned this in the email, that perhaps, Juliet, because the name community is in the center's title, that you might start off with giving us some sense of the meaning of community for you, and perhaps how it resonates with the center's concept.
Thank you very much, Scott. Community. This is an enormous concept, and I think it's also something that a sense of people and togetherness that we are having profound thoughts about during this pandemic period. Profound thoughts about really what brings us together, what inspires us, what produces a feeling of connectivity and of common sharing across different levels of experience, different cultures, different places, geographies, languages, ethnicities, and also of belief. So I think that we are actually at a profoundly important moment in human terms, societally, and for the very specific interest of our research centre is where those human and societal questions really enter the space of culture, and they enter the space of thinking about culture and what is important about culture. I'm an art historian, but I also work widely within the art historical arena. I'm interested in museums, I'm interested in material cultures, I'm interested in spaces of encounter, what the French writer and philosopher has referred to as Pierre Nora has referred to as lieux de mémoire, places that stimulate the idea of connection through memory making. And I'm also interested in how that relates as well to the writing about community and memory, and the writing and the enacting, which is so much part of the artwork and the bigger experience of relating to artworks, both within the space of culture, within the site of the museum, but also more broadly. The cathedral at Coventry, for example, is and remains, or the both cathedrals remain very powerful places, lieux de mémoire, because they draw people across different levels of experience from a remarkably wide geographic and geocultural range to come to that place. Not so much to experience it as a kind of museum to the past, although some might do that, but as a place which is about a living relationship between the past, between the fear that the past might be eliminated, eroded, and something as well that is always there, something that creates and inspires the idea of renewal and reconnection. And I think it's absolutely that profound sense of pilgrimage, and pilgrimage is a very deeply connective idea, which also connects us with this sense of larger experiential world of community that it unites people in a quest for both what makes them and reminds them powerfully of their humanity, but also links them through the things which we engage with in relation to our transhumanity. And this idea of transhumanity contains within it that sense of a spirituality, differently and variously and diversely expressed. But I think really that is, for me, in a nutshell, what community, both in my larger field as a professional, but within our centre, is that idea of connected experiences and cultures, which link us as well with our possibility to be larger than ourselves in a sense of transhumanity.
That's so lovely. Wow. That's really helpful to hear that for me. I mean, I'm a practitioner, so I'm not an academic, and I'm a choreographer, and I work with big groups of people, often untrained, and often intergenerational. And I've often wondered why I'm doing that. You know, sometimes what drew me to do that right from the start, when as a very young choreographer, I wanted to do that. I wanted to make visible exactly what you've just described. So it's sort of, I brought a community together. I made a community for the process of making the work. But what I wanted to illustrate was exactly that, was there's some sort of shared humanity, but what did you call it? A place of encounter, to create places of encounter that were visible for the audience as well. You've really helped me understand what I do. Thank you.
That's the great value of being put on the spot, isn't it? Hopefully things will come out that somehow bring ideas together.
I've had I've had the opportunity to document some of Rosie's work, and making community was one of the, because then I often in that kind of process, name processes, I come up with names of things. So Rosie's choreographic approach, at least a part of it seemed to be fit very nicely into this kind of name of making community. But I'm really fascinated with what you can bring to bear. I'm also not a historian in that sense. I'm more sort of practice focused researcher, but it's really lovely to hear, you know, somebody who's been spending time thinking about history, like you. I think of you, Vicky, as well, with your work. That's a cue.
Is that a segue? Yeah, I mean, when the email came through, Scott, you know, I was very clear that I don't really work or think specifically with the term community, but, you know, I work with more about collectivity, the concept collective, and specifically, you know, my interest in British theatre dance of the first half of the 20th century, and how that can be thought to negotiate collective trauma of British national identity in that time period. And I was struck, you know, with Rosie's and also Juliet's sort of concept of I guess it would be place, or the importance of place as a kind of ontology. I think as producing a particular kind of way of knowing, and also how that impacts embodiment. Or influences knowing in and around the being of a subjectivity in a sense of physical, corporeal existence. You know, the example that I continually go back to is, you know, the Blitz in London, and theatre performance, especially dance, because that's my area. Where you would have these sirens go off and people would stay in their seats. They would not go to air raid shelters, you know. And this is especially around, you know, the V1 and V2 rockets. And the V2 rockets, of course, you couldn't hear them, so bang, you're dead. And and the way in which that became a kind of communal expression of a corporeal relationship with others. You know, something that theater, I think, is an environment and in ontology seems to excel at. But I think in the work of Rosie's, Rosemary, Rosie,
So that's fine.
you know, that kind of way in which you extend that to other places is really quite phenomenal.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think you've touched on something as well that is really at the forefront of thinking about community at present, which is the relationship between community and experiences of suffering and trauma, and how people negotiate those relationships in terms of community and collectivity. I mean, what is it, for example, that turns a collectivity into a community? Is there some additional ingredient? And I'm also struck as well by the shift in perspective from, you know, what has been often a favourably invoked idea. It's an important idea, which is Benedict Anderson's famous imagined communities, which is wonderful. And we've all worked with that to explore the possibility of communities that are transcultural, that are moving, unfixed, that are generative, precisely because of, you know, their association with a certain kind of perception and desire for mobility. But there's another kind of space of community, which I think what we're talking about here, which is that idea of a connection with place and with the importance of a relationship and an engagement with place in that powerful sense. So it's that really important navigation. I mean, we saw last November, for example, how much more in the foreground in terms of the war commemoration celebrations, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which provided a very clear example in 2020 that there seemed to be a desire, a need to reconnect with an idea about a place of suffering, you know, from the 100-year period, that made a relationship between that more distant past, that seemingly more distant past, and what was happening now. So something that moved across the individual to the collective experience, which was really focused on that tomb. And we see as well pictures at the moment of the ways in which cathedrals have become bound up with a sense of the possibility of a kind of redemption for people who are coming together in these spaces because they're getting their vaccinations. So cathedrals are being used in a fundamentally fascinating relationship with how, for example, the earliest of the great medieval masons and theologians wrote about the cathedral as this great place where communities would come into being. It is the great sort of center of the idea of the crux of a world which is unimaginably different from our own, granted, but nevertheless, the idea of something which was coming from the Dark Ages into light, because these were also places of light through the windows, through the transparency, through the colored glass, through the sense of rituals that connected people sensorially, because these were very sensory spaces. They weren't predominantly just visual, they were excitingly sensory.
It's interesting that the cathedral is like the gathering for communities in light, and in the theatre it's the black box, it's the gathering of people in darkness. I really like the two images of these cavernous spaces that bring people together. Yes. When you said that, I didn't know that about I hadn't noticed this gathering for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but I'm personally incredibly moved by the idea of the tomb of an unknown person. I find it far how can I put it? Less troublesome than when it's a specific person. Sorry, this is becoming rather topical. I realise that's why I'm trying to be careful with my words. But the fact that it's unknown somehow speaks to absolutely everyone. And I think in terms of dance, I've often wondered, because I'm not illustrating a community that is talking to each other. They're not face to face. They're not in conversation, but they're in conversation through proximity and through spatial relationships and through shared endeavors or through movement. So therefore, you don't have to get into any of the troublesome bits of what doesn't connect us. You know, that I believe this and you believe that, or you're this generation and I'm that generation. I'm this gender and you're that gender. None of the things that might divide us need to be there because we're not voicing them. And I think sometimes I think the work is it's almost about indifference, but it's about profound connection that doesn't need to be spoken of. It's just seen. And while you describe people in cathedrals and vaccinations and gatherings to look at works of art, I have the same feeling of how you describe people in that space as I do when I'm dancing with people. I can't, it's like this connection that doesn't need to be spoken of because but it's very powerful and very tangible. Felt, very felt.
Yes, it's very interesting. Some of the exhibitions which reopened last year to the public across Britain and elsewhere, individuals who were being interviewed. So these are the communities, you know, to some degree, the relatively unspoken communities of people, because these were interviews not necessarily with experts or curators, or those, you know, at the forefront, as it were, of the cultural relationship with the institution, but people just coming and going, who were giving they were asked about their experience of the exhibition. And what came over really strongly, fascinatingly, well, it was being with people and being able to look at things. And ironically, this was a very good exhibition that was on in the Design Museum. Ironically, much of the exhibition was dealing with virtualized and new digital innovations. So there seemed to be a wonderful, and I love the irony of the flip back to the embodied, because the value that was being expressed about that experience was standing together with other people. And it was exactly your point, Rosemary, and Victoria has also touched on this as well, about proximity and being actually close to someone. So you sensed somebody's reactions, and they were aware of the bodily reactions of people standing beside them in ways which perhaps this very, very dominant emphasis that we've had certainly in Western culture on the visual as the primary way of knowing and experiencing the world, I think was very striking and very compelling.
That's the one of the I was thinking about this topic today, and I have a connection to the Endangered Material Knowledge Project, which is a British museum project funded by Arcadia. And one of the things that they say that they center their research on community epistemologies, in the sense that that they're looking at close collaborative working relationships in a material culture context. So the bodily practice, you know, the community there is, but the binding, the bonds are somehow established through this ways of knowing things, ways of knowing how to build things, ways of knowing how to cultivate land. So it's very place, you know, thinking back to everybody's mentioned this strength of place, and I think that it's highly charged there because the entanglement with the environment in relation to others is quite fundamental over time as well. So this, but I kind of because I have an interest in bodily practice as a way of knowing, so I have this, you know, tendency to look out for keywords like community epistemologies and things like that. But it's that came up for me as I was thinking about today, and also I think what you were saying, Rosie, about the nature of the practice. We always skirt around with embodiment and with bodily ways of knowing things. We find ourselves constantly oscillating between the experience of things that take place for us as we're doing them, and what happens when that moment is past and we're either we're thinking about it or we're bringing it back in some form, mediating it in some way. We're always caught in that bind of kind of falling out of the event into a space where we're, talking about it.
Which has been the case for the last year, really.
Yeah.
As we sit in our chairs here, talking to each other.
But when you did, sorry.
No, I was, just all three of you, just this point about practice, that you're in this space of performance, that one of the key elements that has been so much thought about and discussed is, of course, the lack of the chemistry, the lack of the reciprocity between the performance, between the bodily practice, the bodily encounter, and the audience, because something is happening in that space. We could call it perhaps a community epistemology, where a certain way of kind of knowing and relating to the performance has changed, and that loss of that chemistry of encounter is something that people have been are so keenly aware of. As, for example, we know that some of the great companies like Royal Opera House have wrestled, with how they bring people back into spaces to start to begin to rebuild those relationships again.
Yeah, because associated with that desire to come back together is that lingering fear of proximity.
Mm-hmm.
When I watch various television shows, before I even sort of process the plot, it's like the visual impact of people standing so close together for me is actually quite it affects me almost physically. Like I have this feeling of, oh, they shouldn't be standing so close together. It's a very strange thing.
Yeah. And it's so quick, isn't it? So quick to enter our bodies. I had a nightmare the other day, first one that I don't remember my dreams very well, so maybe it wasn't my first, but of trying to get down an alleyway and suddenly it was really crowded and I was trying to get out and I was touching everyone and I thought, wow, how that's only taken a year for it to become the stuff of my subconscious. Frightful. Yeah. But it will soon go as well. Just as easily it comes, it will go. I'm sure of that. But yeah, I just thought how we know this place so well, because when Vicky, you described that audience sitting still, caught in that moment of togetherness that was so powerful that they didn't leave the space to go to save themselves on some level. Yeah. I absolutely know how that would have felt. It's so tangible, isn't it? And yet it's so hard to talk about. And yet as soon as you described it, I was there. I could imagine how you're kind of caught in this sort of spell. And it made me think about spaces as holding spaces for experience as theatres and cathedrals. And with my practice, Julia, I've moved to the outside, to bigger spaces, and often the spaces I choose do have boundaries so that they're vaguely human scale. But recently I've done things with much bigger horizons and much more disparate. And I'm putting the work in such a risky place, I realise, because there's nothing to hold that moment of encounter together in space. It's much more dispersed. But I think I'm testing to see whether we can all have those moments of encounter, but very far away, almost windsweeptly across a beach or in a big park. And yeah, it's almost like I'm pushing the possibility of communal experience to its limit spatially. I'm not sure why I'm doing that, because I might shoot myself in the foot, but I wonder if it's something to do with the belief that, that I'm so curious about the wild. I don't work in really wilderness spaces, but curious about our sense of place in a much bigger space where we see horizon and sky and earth, how we connect to each other and nature which is similar, I think, to what we're talking about, but it's just not quite so, I can't even put my finger on it. It's not quite so intensely connected. It's usually quite individual. Maybe it's that.
Yes. I think this interesting in the relationship of the kind of boundaries of the communal as well is very, very interesting, because what you've been talking about has just struck me. This could also articulate new ways in which, when we think about how people right across in very different experiences may wish to re-encounter culture, what might have changed? I mean, what will remain? What will be continue to link people together in those spaces? But what will also have changed? And the striking trajectory of this takes us again back to the 19th century and back to the late 18th, but 19th century in particular, is something that I've been very interested in recently when I was exploring the idea of memory and the performance of the modern in Mani's work. And when I was thinking about that, something came home to me with an absolute sort of epiphany, and that was this whole theatre of the modern that Mani is engaged with is about the performance. It is also so focused on the idea of spectacle, and it's this emphasis on the spectacle in the place of the gathering, whether it's the museum or the gallery or the race course or the place of entertainment, becomes almost so dominant that it seems to begin to exclude the value of other levels of experience. So all that layering of the experiential, all that relationship with the body that is both in culture and, as Peter Brook wonderfully says, is somehow, outside of culture as well. Is working always in some place which is outside of the kind of cultural boundary, begins to be all about the visual, and this world of the ocular centric that has been talked about by Philippe Hamon and so many others, and that we have been on this trajectory, and if anything, the mode of the world of digital experience and digital experience has seemed to really, really amplify that emphasis on ocularity. So it strikes me as well that there is an important way in which a discussion about community, boundary and culture is resetting itself and asking fundamental questions about that relationship with the visual, with the spectacle, with being in that place, with that whole idea of the bodily as a kind of spectacle. And that rethinking that in terms of another modality of encounter, another modality encounter which brings to bear, those much more kind of liminal relationships that touch on this thing that I talked about first, that are really kind of in that space of our transhumanity, where we connect, outside of ourselves, and move into that kind of domain as well.
Rosie, that's exactly what I think is so powerful in your work, is that it creates these spaces of liminality in your use of place, I think.
Yes, that's, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. It does, yes, that's really helped me.
That might be not a bad place to bring some clothes off. I think it's been fascinating to to listen to the set of connections that have emerged. I think that's been it's great to be writing notes and thinking at the same time as we have just such a conversation. Thank you all. I think then we'll bring this to a close, and so then see you hopefully.
Somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, anyway, we can bring it to a close now. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely
Thank you, everyone.
to talk with you guys.
It
Yeah.
was wonderful. So many encounters
Yes. Likewise.
and
Thank you.
spaces of thought. Wonderful.